Okay, we're good. We're good? Okay.
Sneaking here for a minute. Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry for the little technical difficulty. Hopefully folks online are plugged into. Michael, are they in and available? Super. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. And good afternoon to the second session of this semester's Colloquium series on education policy from the program on education policy and governance here at the Kennedy School. My name is Jim Pizer, and it's my privilege to serve as Master of Ceremonies for these events under the leadership of Paul Peterson and Marty West, and the whole PEPG team who's represented here today. And we'll be meeting most Thursdays here in Taubman at noon throughout April and streaming online over Zoom. So hopefully you all will be able to join us multiple times over the course of the semester. We've got a bunch of outstanding speakers who will be presenting research on a variety of topics. Antonio, is all okay? Okay. Including things like school choice, post-COVID learning recovery, early college, and a lot more. Next Thursday's session will feature a conversation with Mark Schneider, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the former director of the Institute for Education Services, or IES, then the Department of Education in Washington, which has become famous or infamous recently, as I'm sure you're all aware. In that about $900 million of contracts coming out of IES research contracts were canceled on the recommendation of Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency. Mark will give us his perspective on these recent developments, as well as his experiences working in IES for, I think it was 6 years as a director, along with some recommendations for where we go from here, so don't miss it. Today's topic has an international focus featuring Dr. Isabela Munevar, to my right, on the efficacy of Catholic school education in Chile, and lessons that we might learn here in the United States on effective schools. And as you'll learn, since 2016, Chile has operated a national school lottery system for student enrollment that cuts across public, private, and parochial sectors, which of course creates an ideal environment for research that Isabela has taken great advantage of. Here in Massachusetts, as in most other parts of the country, student enrollment processes for district schools, charter schools, private schools are all run entirely separately. With the partial exception of a few places like Denver, Colorado, Newark and Camden in New Jersey, Washington, D.C., and New Orleans, which operate under universal enrollment systems, universal though covering only district and charter schools, not private schools. And these cross-sector enrollment systems may have a lot to learn from the Chilean experience, and many other jurisdictions who might be considering a more open enrollment approach might have a lot to learn as well. And the issue becomes even more relevant, potentially at least, through the expansion of publicly funded voucher programs and ESA policies that are gaining momentum in a variety of states around the country, which creates even greater potential for more transparent and open educational choice marketplaces. Isabela Munevar is a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Center for International Development. She holds a PhD in economics and education from Columbia University, as well as a BA and an MA in economics from Los Andes University in Bogota, Colombia. This summer, she will join the economics department at the Universidad de los Andes in Chile as an assistant professor of economics. After Isabela's comments, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers and discussion. And we'll give priority to folks in the room, but hopefully we've got some folks watching online. Michael will monitor the chat and we'll try to loop them in. So if you've got questions and you're watching online, please write them in the chat and we'll try to get to you. This session is being recorded. It will be posted on the web, so everything is on the record. And with that, let me turn it over to Isabela.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that great introduction and for introducing what I'm going to present today. This was my job market paper, actually, from last year's job market. Economics job market, and it's titled Catholic School and Student Performance, Evidence from School Admission Lottery. This is a work in progress, so I'm still receiving new data that I'm processing and cleaning to have more accurate results and hopefully all the things that we can learn about the efficacy of Catholic schools. So what's the motivation behind this paper? So Catholic schools are the largest non-governmental school network in the world. They serve more than 62 million students globally. And despite what most people think, Catholic schools are not always privately funded. Many Catholic and religious schools are sometimes funded via school vouchers. And this happens mainly in schools that in many countries that have school choice programs. This is true in Chile, Netherlands, France, and other countries, but also here in the US, in many states where that have school choice programs and where parents are allowed to choose religious schools to use their voucher. And this becomes even more important in the US. The US recent Supreme Court's mandate is likely to lead to more religious schooling, as I don't know if you know, but there was a charter school that was allowed to be managed or administered by a Catholic institution. So the main point here is that public funds are flowing into these religious organizations. And so it's important to understand whether these religious schools or Catholic schools where they study are good, are better, worse, or what are the effects of attending these religious institutions. So private Catholic schools are known in many countries for consistently outperforming their public school counterparts, but they are also very famous for selecting the best students. And even though we have some evidence about the Catholic schools' effectiveness, the studies that try to understand the Catholic schools' of causal effect on student outcomes have some problems in their identification strategy, as they rely on very strong assumptions for the identification of the causal effect. And so this is the first study that has evaluated Catholic schools in a lottery setting, and also compares the Catholic school effect with other private secular schools. So here in the left, you can see it's a descriptive graph that shows the standardized test scores of 8th grade math of Chilean students from 2015 to 2019. And what you can see, the red line are private Catholic schools, publicly financed through these vouchers, that clearly outperform both the other private schools that are mostly secular, and also outperform by more or less two standard deviations their public school counterparts. So what are the research questions that I'm trying to answer? How are private Catholic schools different from other private and public schools? I'm going to show you some descriptive statistics that show some descriptive statistics of data from the Chilean government, and some surveys that they conduct to students, parents, and teachers to understand their school experience. And so I'm going to show you a little bit about the differences in the school model or the educational model that these three types of schools use to understand a little bit about when it's different about these three types of schools. The second question that I'm going to answer, and I'm going to give you some preliminary results in a minute, is the causal effect of Catholic schools on students' achievement and college application relative to public schools. So I'm gonna try and answer if it's selection or if there's something additional on the production function of Catholic schools that make them better than public schools. And I'm gonna show you also heterogeneous effects by academic ability and gender. And I'm also going to show you effects of secular schools on secular schools compared to public schools. And I'm going to show how these results compare to the effects of Catholic schools versus public schools. So what I do in this paper is that I study the effectiveness of private Catholic schools and private secular schools that are voucher eligible relative to public schools on academic outcomes and college application. I will leverage the centralized admission system in Chile that it's mandated for all private and public schools that receive public funding. So I will compare 9th grade students in 2018 who applied through the centralized admission system and had some variation in their preferences. These 2018 students who applied to 9th grade were set to graduate in 2021. So I'm gonna be able to see their graduation rates and also their college entry exam that is like similar to the SAT here. As well as their preferences when students apply in Chile to college, they apply to college and major. So I'm also going to be able to see what are the differences in major preferences after 4 years of attending a Catholic or a public school. So how I'm going to identify this effect? So the seat allocation in the centralized admission system is determined by an algorithm that assigns seats based on preferences and priorities, which breaks ties through random lottery draw. It's very similar to the charter school lottery here in the US, specifically to the New York City one. And for the model that I'm going to use to estimate the effect, we will use an IB model, which instruments private school attendance with being offered a seat through this centralized admission system. So the identification strategy is based in Abdulkadiroglu and co-authors 2017 paper that says that assigning students to seats conditional on their probability of getting an offer depends on a random lottery draw. So I'm going to use that exogenous variation to estimate these causal effects. So a little bit of the preview of the results. So in terms of the school comparison, that is completely descriptive. I'm going to show you that when comparing selectivity, parent engagement, and other characteristics, all three schools seem to be very different. I'm going to show you also that the Catholic school impact on student outcome, that is causal, using the centralized admission system. I find that students attending to Catholic private relative to public schools are 17% more likely of presenting the college entry exam. They're also like 33% more likely to score above the average national mean in math, and 45% more likely of scoring above the national mean on reading. And this is driven mainly by female students. So the female students apparently are the ones who benefit from going to these Catholic schools. However, I also see that students attending to Catholic schools compared to public schools are twice as likely to drop out if the student is male and low performing at baseline. They're also 40% more likely of being accepted to college, primarily if the student is high performing at baseline. And another thing that's very interesting is that 50% the female students are 50% more likely to apply to health-related majors and 80% less to STEM-related majors. And I don't see this pattern for male students. So even though female students appear to be benefiting in terms of learning from Catholic schools, these girls are also deterred from pursuing more competitive majors that tend to be more have better labor returns after graduation. In terms of when I compare with causal the impact to attending secular private schools, the estimated coefficients of private secular versus public schools are smaller than the Catholic school coefficients. However, they are statistically significant from the Catholic schools. This may be because the Catholic school effect is just a private school effect, or because I'm underpowered right now. I'm gonna be able to see 2 additional cohorts that will cover a bigger part of the country that will allow me to identify better if this is the case, that Catholic schools are just another private school, or if the coefficients are really statistically different. What's the contribution of this paper? So this is the first paper to study Catholic schools in a lottery setting. Catholic schools have been long studied. However, they have mixed findings and they rely on strong assumptions for identification. This is also the first paper that can compare private Catholic schools to private secular school effects relative to public schools. A private school effect has been has been long studied here in the US, very well studied using the charter school lotteries here in many states. where they see that Catholic schools are have a positive effect in student learning. However, these effects are mostly linked to some type of charter schools that are called the non-excuses approach, or the KEEP schools, that are the schools that are like more strict and have more strict characteristics. The charter schools effect is mostly driven by female students, which is very similar to what I'm going to show you. And so the differential effects of attending Catholic schools by gender and based on inability is also another part where I'm contributing to. So I'm gonna give you a little bit of context of schools in Chile. 45% of schools in Chile are public and directly financed by the government. So it's 45% of schools in Chile are the public schools that we know here in the US. 35% are private secular schools financed with public funds through vouchers. So they would be more like a charter school here in the US that is mostly managed by a secular private institution. And 15% are private Catholic schools financed with public funds through vouchers. So these are like charter schools, but managed by a Catholic or religious institution. So what is a Catholic school in Chile and in most countries in the world? Is a Catholic school is a school, or in this study, Catholic school is a school affiliated to a Catholic church. So these are schools that are directed by an ecclesiastical authority or are officially recognized by the Catholic Church through a written document from the ecclesiastical authority. These schools that are not necessarily directed by an ecclesiastical authority, but are officially recognized, must align with Catholic teaching and values, and a diocesan bishop guides the school's Catholic identity. I got this data from Gregory Elacuan Santos, who looked at the archives of the Catholic Church, and I was able to merge those with the administrative records of the Chilean government to understand which schools were part of the Catholic Church. So in terms of descriptive statistics, there's very few single-sex schools in Chile. However, the majority of them are Catholic, or also Catholic private schools do not tend to offer be present in the rural area in Chile. Most rural schools are public. In terms of teacher characteristics, they're pretty similar. However, teachers in the private sector are more likely to be tenured. In terms of student characteristics, we see pretty similar characteristics in terms of sex of the student. However, a little bit more, a bigger proportion of female students in Catholic institutions, and a lot more, a bigger percentage of low-income students in public schools. In terms of religious education, this is important. So in Chile, the national curriculum is a very old curriculum that mandates 2 hours of religion class every week. However, what public schools do is that they turn this religious class to like an ethics class or civics class. And in Catholic schools, they do teach the religion. Right. So in terms of the standardized tests, this is the same thing as the graph I showed you at the beginning. So Catholic schools outperform both voucher secular schools and public schools. So I'm going to show you some of the descriptive statistics comparing these 3 types of schools. So I analyzed data that was collected in 2017. This is before the centralized admission system was implemented in Chile. Chile started the centralized admission system where schools that received public funds needed to run these lotteries as of 2016, 2017, but the population of students that I'm looking at in these surveys were not enrolled through this lottery system. This is important because I'm going to show you some questions about the selection and entrance of some of these students before the lottery was implemented. So I'm going to conduct a principal component analysis to characterize the schools. I do these to group questions so that I can more easily characterize schools in terms of selection at entrance, strictness, parent participation, etc. I'm going to show you some of these examples. So for example, for the selection at entrance, before the centralized admission system was implemented, I used questions such as a question that was asked mostly to parents, which of the following requirements or background information were requested when the student applied to this institution? Where you required transcripts from previous schools, parent interviews, the student had to take a written exam or an entrance exam. So what you can see here is that private Catholic schools were much more likely to be very selective at entrance compared to public schools and private secular schools. In terms of parent involvement in school activities and student performance, you can see that private Catholic school parents are much more are asked to participate a lot more in school activities. So I used questions such as on a scale from 1 to 7, what grade would you give to the following aspects of the institution? The frequency with which parents and guardians are informed about the academic and personal progress of students. I also use questions such as how many days of the month are you asked to go to school, etc. In terms of rigor in school policies, I used questions that were asked to students and teachers. For example, how much do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Students respect the rules of schools of the code of conduct. And this was asked to the teachers, and other questions that were asked to students, like, what do you think of the following actions? Not attending classes, copying during an exam. So they were asked, like, how bad do you think that those actions are? And so what you can see is that it looks like private Catholic schools are much more rigorous in terms of school policies. And this resembles a lot the characteristics of charter of a non-excuses approach charter schools, right? In terms of well-behaved students, we can also see that teachers report that the private Catholic school students are much more well-behaved than students in the other institutions. And so to summarize, what makes a Catholic school different when looking at these surveys? So students Catholic schools tend to be more confident academic ones. They feel less appreciated by their teachers, which is the only negative thing that I saw in these surveys. They like more their school and would recommend it to others. They consider their school more strict. Parents in Catholic schools with Catholic schools, parents of Catholic school students report going through a more selective admission process, and they report being much more involved with school activities and their children's performance. In terms of teachers of Catholic schools, they report having a better work environment than teachers in other, and collegiality compared to teachers in other institutions, and they report better behaved students at their classroom. So now I'm gonna start with the empirical strategy for the second part of this paper that tries to causally estimate the effect of attending a Catholic school compared to a public school. So I'm gonna give you a little bit of background about the centralized admission system of Chile. So since 2016, parents who were seeking to enroll their children in a new school were required to participate in the centralized admission system. This means a parent with a child that was going to start in kindergarten, but also a parent that, for example, had a child in 8th grade and wanted to change the student to another school in 9th grade, had to participate in the lottery. Students whose school only went until primary and had to switch to a middle school, they also had to participate in the lottery. And so how do they participate in the lottery? In the lottery, parents had to rank 10 schools in order of preference, and the students were assigned a priority level for each selected school. So, for example, students who were returning students had the first priority. They were mostly like assured a seat at that school. Students who had siblings, they had the second priority, meaning that if I have a brother at that school, I have a priority of 2. students whose parents worked at that school had a priority of 3, and students who at some point were enrolled at that school had a priority of 4. And so the important thing, or the exogenous variation that I'm using here to the causally estimate the effect of attending a Catholic school, is that a random lottery number was assigned to each student for every school they applied to. And so seats were allocated using this deferred acceptance algorithm. And when there was a tie between 2 students who had the same priority level, the tie was solved with this lottery number. So I'm using that that lottery, or that exogenous variation, to estimate my effects. So this centralized admission system partially solved the student selection problem by randomly assigning seats for oversubscribed schools. However, as you saw, there were so the preferences and priorities also play a role here. So students who, for example, have a high priority for Catholic schools were more likely to get to a Catholic school, or had a higher, or they, for example, had a sibling at a Catholic school, were more likely to attend a Catholic school than a student that didn't have a sibling in a Catholic school. So how I solve this is I control for the probability of getting a seat at the different types of schools, which, after controlling for that, would make Catholic schools as good as random. Assignment at a Catholic school as good as random. And following Abdulkadiroglu, Andres, Patak, and co-authors paper published in Econometrica in 2017, showing that after controlling for this probability, the assignment is as good as random. And how do I calculate that probability? So I was able to obtain the algorithm for that is used to assign students to seats in the Chilean government, and I simulated that algorithm 1,000 times. And for each time I simulated that algorithm, I changed the lottery number that was assigned to the student from randomly, right? So what that allows is that every time I simulated the algorithm, the student was assigned to a different school or the same school, but in the end, after the 1,000 simulations, I'm able to see in those 1,000 simulations in which school the student was assigned to. And so at the end, what I have is a probability. If I add up the number of times the student was assigned to that school divided by the number of simulations, I'm able to get the probability of the student being assigned to that specific school. I then add up the number of times the student was assigned, the probability of being assigned to the different Catholic schools the student applied to, and I have these 3 probabilities: the probability of attending to a Catholic school, the probability of attending to a private secular school, and the probability of attending to a public school. So yeah, I'm gonna show you the results in a minute. In terms of the timeline of the data, I use data from 2017 to 2022. The data from 2017 to 2018 is the data where it's the time when the students applied to the lottery. They by then they were in 8th grade, and I also have their baseline ability, because in 8th grade they had to present this standardized test that's called SIMSE in Chile, where they are tested in math and reading. I'm also able to see if they were low income status, where they lived, etc. So this is important because I'm also able to control for those characteristics, but also see if my different samples of students who attended Catholic, public, and secular were different in observable characteristics at baseline, to see if my sample is balanced or not. In terms of, in the data from 2018 to 2022 is the 4-year treatment period, where I can see if the student was enrolled or not in each of these years. At the end, in 2022, I'm able to see their college entry exam results and their college application, where I can see also their major preferences. So to which majors they applied, and where if they got accepted or not. So in terms of my sample, so this is very important. I can't use all the sample of the students who applied to the lottery, because the students who had a probability of 1, meaning that they ranked only Catholic schools, or they never ranked a Catholic school, or they were assured a Catholic school seat because they were returning students, these students don't have a variation in their seat allocation, depending on that lottery number, right? So they don't give me any information to estimate the coefficient of the effectiveness of attending a Catholic school. So for that reason, I only use students that have a probability between 0 and 1 of attending a Catholic school. So in the end, the sample that I'm working with is 3,700 students, of which 1,400 were assigned a seat at a public school, 1,200 were assigned a seat at a private Catholic school, and 1,000 were assigned a seat at a private secular school. So how do I check for balance if my different samples of students are similar, and if if controlling for that probability really balances the sample, and it's okay to compare the effect of the students attending to these different types of schools. So I check for balance, running a regression of the baseline characteristics of the students on assignment to the different types of schools. I control for the probability of attending each of these schools, and I check whether the difference is significant or not. The good thing is that the sample is balanced in 16 out of 17 baseline variables. I don't think I can click on the, yes, I can show you the table is in the paper. And what you can see is that before controlling for the, oh, thank you so much. So before controlling for the, in the column number 5, before controlling for the probabilities, what you can see is that the balance is not sampled. There's differences in the baseline school GPA, if the student is female, how many years they were enrolled in a Catholic school before, also in their choices, etc. However, after you control for that propensity score, you see that the differences are not significant, and in many of the cases it's 0. I only have the significant value in 8th grade, but this can be just by chance because I'm looking at more than 17 different variables. Okay, so for my first stage, what so I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to instrument attending a Catholic school, attending a secular school, and attending a public school with the being offered a seat at that school, right? Because the fact that I'm offered a seat at each of these types of school doesn't mean the student is gonna enroll in that school, because they can just say no, right? If they say no, what happens to that student? If they were in a school already enrolled, and for the next grade where they were seeking a new school, the school has they will be assured a seat at the school they were at. If the student doesn't have a seat, they will be assigned to the closest school that has to their house that has that has a vacant seat. So I control again in this first stage. I control for the propensity scores, and also I control for the assignment to a single sex school, just because I don't wanna. So I want to try and isolate the effect of attending a Catholic school from attending a single sex. So in the second stage, I'm gonna regress the outcomes on the instrumented variable of enrollment in a Catholic school and a secular school, and I'm gonna control for all the probabilities. So this is the first stage results. What you can see here is that this is a strong instrument for school enrollment. So 70, more or less 70, from 60 to 70% of schools of students who were offered a seat at the different types of schools enroll in the school. And now I'm going to turn into the second stage results. So as for the first results, I'm going to just show you like the overall results of attending a Catholic school in both learning and college attendance and major choice. And then I'm going to split the sample by female and male students and the combination of high performing at baseline female students and high performing at baseline male students, and the same thing for low performing for both sexes. So the first set of results shows that Catholic schools are more likely to so students attending a Catholic schools are more likely to present the college entry exam and score above the national mean in almost every subject. So you can see here that students attending a Catholic school are as a 33% more likely of scoring above the national mean in math, 45% in reading. It's not significant, but you can see that's mostly positive in science also and in history. And I also see that students in Catholic schools are more likely to get accepted to college and apply to a health-related major. In terms of the differences in female and male students, we can see that the positive effect in learning of attending a Catholic school is mostly driven by female students. We don't see much of an effect in male students, and the effect of taking the college entry exam is positive both for females and males. Interestingly, when we look at major preferences between male and female students, we see an interesting pattern that appears for female students, but that we don't see in male students, and is that in female students are less likely to apply to STEM majors and much more likely to apply to health majors if they attend a Catholic school instead of a public school. And when you look at male students, you don't see that pattern. Also, we see that male students are like both of them, but most for male students is significant. They are more likely to get accepted to college. In terms of high achieving girls and boys, we see here that the positive effect of learning is mostly, you'll see that it's mostly driven by high performing students, but mostly by high performing female students. So high performing female students are the ones that benefit the most of attending these Catholic schools. Remember, the Catholic schools are more strict, are ask more from parents and students in general. So these results make sense. And they also are very similar to the results that have been found here in high achieving charters. In terms of college application, we can see also that top of the class or high performing at baseline students, both girls and boys, are more likely to get accepted to college than if they attend a public school. Girls that are top of the class are much more unlikely, however not significant, of applying to STEM majors, and also more likely to apply to health majors. In terms of low performing boys and girls, we see here that the only ones that benefit a little bit of attending Catholic schools are low performing girls. However, low performing boys don't have an effect on learning. However, they do have a positive effect, and very big, of dropping out. What it's dropping out in this context is literally not appearing in any school. I have both data for private financed and publicly financed schools. So, or they are not in, or they dropped out and they are not going to finish high school, or maybe they would re-enroll in a year after. But as of now, as of 2021, I don't see them enroll in any school. In terms of mixed-sex Catholic schools, the mixed-sex appear to be driven most of the result. However, I have very few single-sex schools, so this may be also just the fact that single-sex schools are disappearing in Chile. Now, this is the last part of my results that look at the effect of going to a private secular school compared to a public school. And here I'm comparing both the effect of private versus public and private Catholic versus public and private secular versus public to show you that. So the differences is not significant in any coefficient. However, the Catholic school effect is always bigger. So it looks like Catholic schools are better than private secular schools, but it's not very clear if they are really different from other private secular schools. So this is a question that remains. I hope that with the new data that I have, I'm going to be able to disentangle this, and if it's private Catholic schools or just another private school that are just more strict and a little bit more demanding from parents, or if they are really different from private secular schools in terms of the outcomes of students. So in terms of the conclusions of the paper, so Catholic schools seem to provide the most significant benefits for high achieving students, especially females. Conversely, they may have a detrimental impact on the academic performance of low performing male students, potentially contributing to their dropout. Attending a Catholic school appears to negatively affect female students' likelihood of applying to STEM majors, and positively affecting the likelihood of pursuing a health-related major. Secular private schools appear to have like very similar effects, however smaller, but we cannot rule out that these effects are statistically indistinguishable from zero. So the question remains, are Catholic schools simply another type of private? So for my next steps, I will repeat these estimations with a new sample, including two larger cohorts, students who applied to the lottery in 2018 and 2019 for 9th grade spots and were set to graduate in 2022 and 2023. This set of results are for a smaller sample for only 5 of the 15 regions in Chile, because the lottery in Chile was staggeredly implemented in the region. So they started with 5 regions in Chile, then they increased it to 14, 13, yeah. And then they included the biggest region, that is the capital of Chile, that is the Región Metropolitana, or the city of Santiago. And yeah, so the good thing about including these two cohorts is that my sample is going to increase by a lot. So right now, I think I'm going to have like 40,000 students who have a probability between 0 and 1 of attending a Catholic school. So I'm going to be able to improve my outcomes, the robustness of my outcomes with more study. So yeah, I'm also very interested in investigating the role of peer effects on Colombian students versus the school value added. What do I mean by this? So because I have many students that were selected through the school before the lottery was implemented, so let's imagine a school that, for example, has grades from kindergarten to 12th grade. So they have students that were in 8th grade in 2018. And so let's say that 80% of those students continued in that school. So those students were assured a seat at that school. However, the other 20% were randomly selected through this lottery because they are incoming students, new students, right? And so I want to try and see what are the differences in the effects of schools that receive more lottery students versus schools that receive less lottery students. And what I'm seeing now in my new results is that it looks like the Catholic schools that outperform public schools are the ones that receive a smaller amount of lottery students, which can mean two things. One, the effect is coming from peers, from the selected peers, or the school is able to have a value added on these incoming students through the fact that they only have to, they have these well-behaved or selected students that were selected before the lottery was implemented, and so they have more resources and time to attend these new incoming students through the lottery that are on average have lower results and come from lower income backgrounds. So yes, thank you. That's
So thank you, Isabela. And why don't we just open it up for anyone who's got a question? We'll just like jump right in.
Thank you. It's a great talk. I was just curious, could you help those of us maybe who are a little more familiar with Catholic schools in the United States to contextualize your results, even starting just with the great graphic you had up early, the descriptive difference, and you're obviously trying to tease out then how much of the Catholic school advantage is causally added. How do your estimates compare to kind of what we know here in the United States in terms of the Catholic school advantage? And in particular, I want to know more about what you think is the mechanism that's driving this, because as my understanding in the United States, at least some of the work like James Coleman's work on social capital suggests that is what drives some of the results for Catholic schools here, is that the communities are denser, and not just the schools, but the families. Do you think you can learn anything about that in the Chilean context?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So in terms of the differences between the Catholic school effect in Chile and here in the US, so the Catholic schools here in the US haven't been evaluated through a lottery. However, we do have some studies that find mostly positive effects, especially in college entry, in the probability of attending college, and some in learning as well. So I do think that they are very similar. So what I tried to understand, it was like, what are the similarities of Catholic schools in the different countries of the world, and they seem to have very similar values and characteristics. There's this like website where you can see the church mandate for the Catholic schools who are associated to a church, and you see that they say that they have to be very high quality. They have to they ask parents to participate a lot in the school activities. So what you said, like this social capital, and this is true in most of the Catholic schools around the world. The second question was the mechanisms, right? So in terms of the mechanisms, I think it's hard to know what's happening. What I said at the end of the talk, I'm trying to see whether it could be just the pure effect of this selectiveness that of incumbent students, which are driving the effect, or maybe is something about the another thing in Catholic schools that's making students learn, or something in their production function. I would say it's mostly the fact that there's a lot of selected students that are in convent in Catholic schools compared to public schools. And I would also say that it's very similar to what happens here in high performing charter schools, and is the mechanism also is through dropping, like, how do you say, like gently pushing out the low performing students, and only keeping the high performing, which makes it easy to add value in terms of learning.
As a follow-up, I noticed on one of your earlier charts, the percentage of teachers who were female was pretty much the same all across the board. But in terms of teacher preparation and other characteristics in particular, I wonder what is the religious affiliation of teachers in the Catholic schools. That's declined in this country substantially, but I don't know what it might be in Chile.
I think it's the same thing in Chile. So unfortunately, I can't see the religious affiliation of teachers. I do know that in many Catholic schools in Chile, the teachers nowadays are not necessarily part of the church. However, many of them are Catholic. In Chile, most of the population is can relate to the Catholic religion more than any other religion. However, many of them are not, don't practice the religion. And yeah, so I can't say much about that, unfortunately. But I do think that the Catholic affiliation in teachers has declined also in Chile, as it has here in the US.
My speculation is that if there is a significant percentage who are members of the religious order, that may explain some of the difference in the effects on students.
Yeah, that's a
Because
good,
teacher background.
the teacher value. Yeah, that's really good.
Maybe just to follow up on that, from a somewhat different dimension, do you have any data or any broadly information about the differences, if any, in teacher qualifications in three different sectors?
Yes, I do, and I don't see.
They're
much of the
roughly, so they're
difference.
roughly similar.
They're roughly similar in terms of makeup of degrees, of educational attainment, years of experience, as you saw, like 13 or 15 years of experience on average. So yeah, it's not a lot of the difference comes from that, nor the, for example, percentage of females teachers that you saw was very similar. But I do have these, like, yeah, I want to really know and understand what's the religious background. That may also explain part of the.
And maybe just as a point of clarification, is there a sort of national curriculum that all the schools are essentially following? And obviously there's variation, but that there's more consistency than difference across what, the content of the instruction?
Yes, so there's a national curriculum that everyone who has the public funding has to follow. Or at least not as a strict, public schools have to follow it more strictly, but yes, there's.
And just to follow up the question about teaching faculty, do we have like any difference about their income or like working hours by those different kinds of
I don't have that, but there might be some documents that descriptively say something about it. And I think what happens here in the US is that Catholic school teachers work more hours. And I think it's because they are more devoted to the community. That might also be happening in Chile, but I think I can't see that, but I'll look.
I can add something on that
Yeah,
because I'm a teacher from Chile. You receive the same payment if you're in a public or private school. If the school receives funds from the minister, the payment is the same and the hours of work, it's more or less the same. So there's no difference there.
Thank you.
Yeah, as you mentioned about the results, their likelihood of applying in different majors. I'm wondering if there's any like courses design that is different by this kind of schools. Like, do they have like more health related courses or STEM related courses?
I don't think they can because they have to follow like the number. I think you can help me with that, but they have to follow more or less like the number of hours per subject. All the schools that receive public funding. I think the health related major part comes more from the part that the Catholic schools are more prone to be, where they would like ask of their students to be more social and more care giving to the society. So I think it comes from that more than the number of hours they give, right, of any type of subject. And the important thing is that there's a difference in gender, right? So that's
Yeah, and just last question about how you define the like low performance or like high achieving, and about like performance and achieving, is that like different dimensions that you
in terms of high achieving or top of the class, how I see that is if the student, when they enter this new school, if they were below or above the mean of the baseline test score in math. So if I'm an incoming student, we're in the distribution of my new classmates, I am in terms of baseline ability. So if I'm in the above the mean or below.
based on the math score?
Math. But the results are very similar if I use reading as the baseline.
Thanks.
Like, are there any questions in the chat?
Bob Moranto asked, why do publics have such small class sizes? Is it because of greater funding?
No, I think it's because there's a lot more schools in the rural areas, which are way more yeah.
So it seemed that to me that like even in the Catholic schools that apply that stuff. Yes. Do you think there is something like about the norm, maybe the Catholic norm is that women should?
Yeah, that's a remaining question because I think I have two things that may explain that effect. One is Catholic indoctrination or like gender norms, working on doing that, or maybe the mechanism also is the fact that Catholic schools are more competitive or more high performing. And so there's studies in France, for example, that show that women who attend a more competitive high school tend to go to less competitive majors, like they deter from competing.
Okay.
So I'm still working on that and trying to identify which is it, but the fact that I also kind of seeing this pattern in private secular school, I think I'm leaning more towards the competitiveness of the school, of the Catholic schools than however, the health major wouldn't.
For implications for US and thinking about state policy makers that are trying to pass bills to expand school voucher programs, like what should policymakers here learn from Chile? And
Thank you. So that's a great question. That's important. You made me yesterday, because it made me think about, because it's not an easy question. So, but I think one of the main takeaways of this study is that not all schools are good for everyone. So we can generalize that one school is like the best school, or I think we have to take it with a grain of salt when we say like these are the best performing schools, because it's not true that they are the best performing one for all type of student outcomes, but also not for all students, all type of students, right? So for example, I do think that what they try to maximize the different types of schools is different. Public schools try to maximize in terms of not in terms of making students stay in the system, because that's more important for us as a community, right? Than trying to make very, very like a high performing, but like, yeah, to have very high scores in the standardized tests. I think that's right. I don't have an answer of what should they do in terms of, because charter schools do better, but they would have to put maybe more restrictions on the rate at which students may drop out or change schools.
Maybe one just follow up to that based on our conversation yesterday is, correct me if I'm wrong, anybody in the room, but apparently the funding mechanism is such that every school in each sector that participates in the lottery system gets the same amount of money. They basically have, I mean, I assume that they could do some fundraising incrementally on the side, but by and large, they're operating the same funds, regardless of where they are and regardless of which sector they're in, which is obviously very different than the American context.
Only about the gender impact. I remember that you mentioned about the faculty gender, like within the school. I'm wondering if there's like different by the subject, like who's teaching for math, they're like they have more like female.
That's a good point. I haven't looked at that, but I will definitely do that because that might be explained.
Yeah, I do.
Obviously, an obvious question I'm sure you've got before COVID is
Yeah.
going on. I don't know what's going on in Chilean schools, but obviously in the United States, public schools are more likely to be closed than Catholic schools. Is that factor involved?
Yeah, I do definitely think that's a factor. So all schools were closed by the same number of days, if they were public or private, if I'm not wrong. We can, but I do think Catholic schools and private schools had more resources for the online teaching. So that might also be explaining something.
One question following up on something that you mentioned a couple of minutes ago is, and this is obviously somewhat hard to measure, but one of the things that is also a distinguishing feature, certainly of No Excuses charter schools, probably more in the past than currently, but certainly relevant to the research that's been done, is very high expectations in terms of college attendance for their students. So even in kindergarten, you go into kindergarten class and they're banners from where the teacher went to college on the wall. They talk about going to college all the time. Is that something that potentially also is distinctive about what you may experience in a Catholic school versus a public school in Chile?
I do definitely think is the case because we see like a very high effect on terms of the college entry exam. Like the number of students who present the college entry exam, that the effect is much higher in Catholic schools compared to students who go to public schools. However, I don't know. I think point or my Chilean teacher friend, you know, and maybe they know something additional on if Catholic schools have consistently like talk more about college application. A little bit more, okay.
And sort of in the same vein, are there other measures of academic achievement in high school other than the college entrance exam that could be used as a, you know, at a minimum, a check on the validity of the college entrance exam as a
Oh, another,
valid measure?
yeah, I will have some other standardized tests.
Mhm.
Yeah, that are like 2 years after they enroll, but for these new
Okay.
cohorts, because unfortunately, because of COVID, this cohort didn't present the 10th grade standardized test, but the new cohorts, I think I'll have that.
Any other online questions? Anything else?
I have a question, like, like, what do you think of the approach that maybe there's I'm thinking these students that change of school like at 8th grade? And if they are doing really good, like the incentive to change to a Catholic school because they are doing really good. So the parents say, okay, I'm really, my student is really good, so we should change it to a better school. So maybe that's also like helping like this result, like some kind of, if I have high expectations of my children, I will change it to a Catholic private school. So
Yeah, no, that's a really good. The good thing about this, the basic strategy is that because I control for both baseline abilities, but also by these preferences. So if I have a very high preferences of going to a Catholic school because I'm a high performing, I'm controlling that, right? So it will allow me to see. And what you see is that the baseline ability of all students who I used to for the estimation are balanced that baseline in terms of their performance.
Isabella, thank you very much. That was really wonderful. Thank you.